Hi, my name's Eric. I'll be reading you selections from Barron's magazine with an issue date of August 10th of 2026. It's produced by the Audible Local Ledger. A reminder, this is a reading service exclusively for people who are blind or print disabled. We start with Up and Down Wall Street. This is written by Andy Serwer. It's the mansion economy. $10 million is barely enough. Real estate agents are never at a loss when it comes to hyperbole, and as such, their commentary is best taken with buckets of salt. Nonetheless, current assessments of the San Francisco real estate scene have been eye-catching. A hysteria, says one broker. A gold rush situation, says another. Perhaps in a nod to the city's history. And from a real estate economist on X, absolutely bananas in capital letters. But it was this quote, as reported by the San Francisco Standard, that had me spitting out my coffee. As Marie Antoinette as this sounds, there really is a housing crisis at the upper end. A mansion shortage, said Sotheby's agent Annie Williams. Italics are mine. And that was a mansion shortage part that he put in italics. A mansion shortage? Why, we'll have to live in an $8 million, 10,000 square foot flea bag in the East Bay. Snark aside, the fact that a mansion shortage might even be a thing has to be a barometer of sorts. Sure, it reflects the explosive growth in wealth generated in the Bay Area by tech, now hypercharged by SpaceX and the artificial intelligence boom. This is a city that 3 years ago was said to be in a crime-ridden, hollowed-out by remote work doom loop. But luxury residential real estate, properties priced from $10 million to $100 million and up, powered by the ever-rising stock market, is booming across the country, particularly in hot zones like Los Angeles, New York City, and especially South Florida. The scale of wealth has grown far greater in the super-luxury end of the market over the past decade, says Jonathan Miller, a veteran real estate analyst and director of markets at Street Matrix, a housing market research firm. I'll be inspecting a $30 million or $40 million mansion and realize it's the fifth house that these people own. Miller says that 15 years ago he counted 3 sales of homes over $50 million in the U.S. Last year there were 45. Now we're getting $100 million and some $200 million homes, he says. $10 million sales are a dime a dozen. Actually, there were 1,601 homes sold for $10 million or more in the nation's top 10 ultra-luxury markets last year, according to real estate brokerage Compass, which amounted to some $28.6 billion in sales. That's up 31% in sales and 23% in dollar volume over 2024. Compass, by the way, reported BAFO earnings this week, with its CEO noting the company's strong Bay Area business. Chronicling this mushrooming mansion economy is a cottage industry of voyeuristic real estate journalism. Even before Zillow surfing, tracking neighborhood real estate sales has long been a great American spectator sport, a la baseball or football. But drooling over $75 million Malibu mansions and other property porn feels more like watching Formula One races. The housing market for us mere mortals, meanwhile, is tepid. U.S. home sales totaled 4.7 million units last year. That's a 14-year low. And the median sales price of a house sold in the U.S. stuck around $410,000 as of the second quarter of 2026. That's about the same price level as 5 years ago, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. A study by housing research firm Zelman indicates that the highest third of the U.S. housing market has outperformed the lowest third in terms of existing home prices 9 quarters in a row, including the past 3, when the lowest tier declined 0 to 1%. All of the action is on the higher end of housing, says Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics. The weakness is in workforce housing. That's where you see the real shortages, because builders can't make enough money with those types of homes, given the high costs of materials, labor, land, and permitting. Other elements are putting pressure on the low end, says Miller. One thing we learned coming out of the pandemic is when mortgage rates are too low for too long, it actually makes housing less affordable, because it wipes inventory off the face of the earth, he says. That's because when money is dirt cheap, consumers borrow willy-nilly and snap up the housing stock. Now with rates higher, people aren't moving, which makes for a paucity of inventory. Of course, on the higher end, rates matter less. For the last decade, the housing market in Manhattan was 50% cash, says Miller, meaning 50% of buyers pay cash. Over the last couple of years, that's gone up to 65%. The higher the net worth, the higher the purchase price, the higher the probability of a cash buyer. With the stock market up over 23% a year on average over the past 3 years and 13.5% year to date, who cares about rates? In mansion-deprived San Francisco, where at least one seller was reportedly seeking Anthropic or OpenAI stock for their listings, Daniel Hale, chief economist at Realtor.com, sees more evidence of inelastic demand by the wealthy. Realtor.com is owned by News Corp, Barron's parent company. When rates shot up in 2023, down payments surged everywhere, Hale says. You would expect that, because when it's expensive to borrow, people borrow less. But when rates fell, down payments remained elevated in San Francisco. We think that reflects the cash and equity from the AI industry. Some unicorn employees are able to get cash for their stock through company-sponsored tender offers. According to Realtor.com economist Jia Zhu, down payments in Miami, New York City, and Austin, Texas have met or dropped below their 2022 level, while buyers in the Bay Area continue to put 6.6 percentage points more money down to buy a home. That amounts to an additional $198,000 down on an entry-level Bay Area luxury home priced around $3 million. And that's just for pikers. Imagine the money on the highest end. A New York Times study estimates that the SpaceX, Anthropic, and OpenAI initial public offerings could create 20 billionaires, and by extension, who knows how many centimillionaires. No wonder some 144 homes in San Francisco went for $1 million over the asking price in the first half of 2026. As for specific deals, there's the recent $56 million sale of a Beaux-Arts-style mansion in Pacific Heights by a former Google exec, though the city's most expensive home was bought 2 years ago by Laureen Powell Jobs, who paid $70 million for another mansion in Pacific Heights. Down the peninsula in Tony Atherton, which recently supplanted Miami's Fisher Island for the honor of having America's most expensive zip code, 6 homes have sold for more than $30 million this year, with one recently snapped up only 72 hours after being listed, according to the Los Angeles Times. Speaking of LA, that market is now caught up with New York, according to Miller. The record price for a home there, indeed all of California, is the $210 million sale 2 years ago of a Malibu mansion by Oakley, the sunglasses company founder, James Gennard, who reportedly bought the property from Howard Marks, co-chairman of Oaktree Capital Management. The house sits on 9.5 acres, and it includes 300 feet of ocean frontage. The Gennard house edges out another Malibu mansion bought by Jay-Z and Beyoncé for $200 million in 2023. Even more aspirationally, consider what would be far and away America's most expensive home, a $400 million listing in Bel Air, owned by an entity tied to Qatar's ruling Al Thani family, according to the Wall Street Journal. The property has 70,000 square feet of living space, 39 bedrooms, and 3 swimming pools. Oh, perfect for a never-ending party. In New York City, the top property year-to-date is the purchase of a 6,500 square feet, 4-bedroom duplex in the 1,428-foot Steinway Tower on 57th Street, along Billionaires Row, for $42 million. Floor-to-ceiling windows frame unobstructed Central Park views that will be peered through by the buyer. A European billionaire with a family in tow who plans to make it his primary residence, writes the New York Post. According to listing broker Nikki Field of Sotheby's, wealthy Europeans are coming into the U.S. market. drawn by the strength of the euro and pound against the dollar. But the most expensive home in New York and in all of America is Citadel CEO Ken Griffin's $238 million apartment, naturally on Billionaires Row, a 24,000 square foot quadplex, which was bought back in 2019. Griffin's nearly $250 million apartment caught the eye of New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, who, following Willie Sutton's lead, is going after high-end residential real estate, because that's where the money is. Mamdani, singling out Griffin's apartment, has imposed a so-called pied-à-terre tax on non-primary residences for multi-million-dollar homes and apartments. Populist politics are bubbling forth in California, too, where Proposition 40, the California Billionaire Tax Act, which would impose a one-time 5% tax on assets over $1 billion, is on the November ballot. Some non-progressives say that might kill the Golden State's golden goose. Those populist strains, to a degree, have been revving up the ultra-high end of the Florida real estate market. Exhibit A, Mark Zuckerberg's recent $170 million purchase on Miami's Indian Creek Island, down the road from Jeff Bezos' massive new compound. Still, the hyperscaler dudes don't come close to owning the most expensive property in Florida, which was reportedly bought for $225 million 2 years ago by billionaire David Hoffman. Not in Palm Beach, Miami, or even Manalapan, home to Larry Ellison's Gemini compound, but over in Naples. Still, with all the talk of billionaires fleeing New York and the Bay Area, prices haven't exactly softened there, and most of these bros, be they Griffin or top Google execs or Zuck, still apparently own mega mansions in their old blue state stamping grounds. Indeed, in some instances, it's unclear which state is their primary residence. Only the taxman knows for sure, and maybe not even him. Is mansion mania another sign that the bubble apocalypse is upon us? Could be, but more to the point, it seems the shortage here may not be so much in mansions as it is in common sense. Moving on to the Streetwise column by Jack Huff. Pepsi's challenge. It can't seem to keep up with Coke. I think I like Coke Zero more than Pepsi Zero. I can't say for certain because I've been hitting the atomic fireball candies again, and they leave me with the palate of a trash dump goat. Also, studies with real-time brain scans show that the sight of a Coke label can light up the sensory pleasure region, even for subjects who like Coke and Pepsi equally in blind tests. So, in addition to me being periodically tongue anesthetized, I might also be partially zombified from a half-century of Coke ads. All I know is that although I don't mind Diet Pepsi, I reach first for Coke products, and for zero sodas before diet ones. So apparently do many of you. That goes a long way toward explaining why Coca-Cola is clobbering PepsiCo right now, although there's more to it, which I'll explain. Over the past decade, investors have done much better in the S&P 500 index than in Coke or Pepsi. Year to date, however, Coke has made 26%, almost double the index's return, while Pepsi is down a little, even after dividends. Late last month, Coke delivered a near-perfect second quarter financial report. Shares jumped 5% in a day. The company has been gaining share in cola, orange, and lemon lime soda flavors, and killing it with Zero, a major growth driver. What's interesting is that Diet Coke and the classic stuff have been gaining share too, largely at the expense of Pepsi. Behind the scenes, Coke is a transformed company. Just over a decade ago, it collected more than half of revenue from stakes in regional bottling operations, which manufacture soda from concentrate and put it on trucks for local delivery. Today, Coke has sold or is close to selling nearly all of its bottling operations. That makes it an asset-light marketing company, which investors like. It's part of the reason Coke trades at 26 times this year's projected earnings, versus 22 times for the broad market and 16 times for Pepsi, which remains vertically integrated. Pepsi is also more than half food, especially snacks, thanks to its Frito-Lay and Quaker Foods divisions. At the moment, much of Big Food is slumping, and the rise of GLP-1 drugs appears to be a key reason. These drugs can quiet the food noise that drives impulse purchases of cookies and chips. Back to diet soda and the briefest of histories. There was a soda entrepreneur and philanthropist named Hyman Kirsch, who founded a small hospital in Brooklyn called the Jewish Sanitarium for Chronic Disease, and decided that diabetics needed a soda of their own. In 1952, he and a scientist concocted NoCal, the first diet soda, in ginger ale and black cherry flavors to start. It was sweetened with something called cyclamate, which would later be banned after studies linked it to cancer in rats, and it remains banned in the US, even though those studies have been discredited. But never mind all of that. NoCal became a regional hit, and not just with diabetics. One marketing poster showed a fit-looking woman struggling with the last 2 inches of her skirt's side zipper. "Time to switch to NoCal," it read. Another featured a movie star of the day in a bathing suit. "Kim Novak is a NoCal girl," it said. NoCal never adds an inch to her waist or an ounce to her weight. NoCal's growth caught the attention of a larger soda player in Chicago called Royal Crown, which launched Diet Right. And that did so well that Coke and Pepsi were forced to respond, although neither wanted to risk its namesake brand on something so experimental. Coke launched Tab, and Pepsi something called Patio, with both aimed at weight-conscious women. Eventually, these gave way to Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi. I've always assumed that Diet Coke, which made its debut in 1982, was just a bad attempt to mimic the taste of regular Coke. In fact, it was intentionally made more citrusy to mask the metallic aftertaste of saccharin, which was later replaced with aspartame. Remember New Coke? Diet Coke was such a success that executives combined the same flavor profile with high fructose corn syrup. It flopped. Coke Zero, officially called Coca-Cola Zero Sugar, made its debut in 2005, and crucially, this was 11 years before Pepsi got into the zero game. The idea was to copy classic Coke's taste and to avoid the diet label, in part because men had been conditioned to view it as feminine. Coke Zero is sweetened with a blend of aspartame and something called Ace K, because the two help cancel each other's aftertaste. I must be a moderately manly man, trademark still available, because although I drank Diet Coke for years, I've now switched to Zero. Coke is benefiting from its head start in Zero and its continuity. Coke Zero cans today look almost identical to Coke cans. Pepsi went through a weird detour with something called Pepsi Max, which had ginseng, extra caffeine, and the same sweeteners as Coke Zero. But it wasn't obvious from the name that it had zero sugar. In 2016, Pepsi finally dropped the ginseng, normalized the caffeine, and changed the name to Pepsi Zero Sugar. The packaging has changed too many times to count. Hopefully that helps explain why Coke today is stronger in Zero, which ranks behind Classic and Diet in sales, but is growing much faster. One investment bank's bull case on Coke, with a 2.4% dividend yield, is that investors should value it like asset-light success stories in other industries. For example, Marriott International at 31 times earnings. I'm not feeling it. Pepsi, yielding 4.3%, looks ripe for a soda turnaround, but the snacks give me pause. If I had to choose one, I'd choose Coke. But until there's a better entry point, the best big soda steak might be Zero. Moving on with a look back at last week and what's to come this week, we move on to the review and preview section. The column associated with it, Banks Lead a Bonus Boom. Wall Street's year-end bonuses are looking robust after the second quarter, with some lucky souls seeing as much as 15% above 2025. Compensation consultant Johnson Associates dubs it the Year of the Bank in its latest report, with year-end incentive pools 5 to 20% higher than in 2025 at major investment and commercial banks. Everything is shaping up to be a fantastic year for the banks, says the firm's managing director Chris Connors. They really are firing on all cylinders. Record earnings driven by equity trading, underwriting, and advisory services are fueling the bountiful year-over-year increases in bank bonuses. Hedge fund bonuses are projected to be 5 to 15% higher than last year, as they record some of the highest inflows in 2 decades, and as macro funds outperform. Asset management firms could see bonuses rise by 7 to 11% on market appreciation and active exchange-traded fund inflows. Wealth management could see bonuses grow 5 to 10%, family offices 5%, and insurers flat to 5%. Struggling private markets could see results vary. This report is more optimistic than Johnson's flat to slightly higher projections after the first quarter, with Iran war uncertainties high. Markets aren't as focused on the daily ups and downs in the war, though that could change, warns Connors. Artificial intelligence is affecting hiring, especially for junior jobs, but not necessarily among revenue-generating executives. And that was written by Janet H. Cho. Last week in markets, after threatening the largest U.S. attack since World War II, President Trump said talks with Iran would resume. Iran denied it, but oil prices fell and stocks rose. The U.S. joined Japan in supporting the yen, selling euros to buy yen. And on Wednesday, Iran neared a deal with Oman to regulate Strait of Hormuz shipping. The economy lost 23,000 jobs in July, and May and June were revised down, easing rate fears. On the week, the Dow Industrials rose 3%, the S&P 500 3.6%, a new closing high, and the Nasdaq Composite 5.2%. In companies last week, SpaceX reported a lower loss than expected and stronger revenue, but shares fell after Elon Musk aired spending plans on data centers. Musk also said that SpaceX would only buy NVIDIA chips. Advanced Micro Devices shares sank. Banks plan to sell $15 billion in Alphabet debt for a Texas data center that's leased to Anthropic. Models from OpenAI and Anthropic went rogue in United Kingdom testing. Deals last week. The Financial Times reported that AstraZeneca and Bristol-Myers Squibb were in talks on a $400 billion merger. Banca Monte dei Paschi di Siena is reviewing options after a merger with Banco BPM collapsed, clearing the way for Intesa Sanpaolo's $35 billion bid. Pipeline operator Williams Companies struck a $5.5 billion deal for EnCap Flatrock Midstream, owned Momentum Midstream. Apollo Global Management agreed to buy EasyJet for $7.7 billion, topping a Castle Lake bid. And Prologis is buying UK rival Segro for $18.8 billion. This week, on Tuesday, August 11th, the National Association of Realtors reports existing home sales for July. Consensus estimate is for a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 4.05 million homes sold, slightly less than in June. The median price of an existing home hit a record high of $440,600 in June. On Wednesday, August 12th, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the Consumer Price Index for July. Economists forecast a 3.4% year-over-year increase, 0.1 of a percentage point less than in June. The core CPI is expected to rise 2.5%, compared with 2.6% previously. It was last at or below the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target in March of 2021. Cisco Systems announces earnings on Wednesday, followed by Applied Materials on Thursday. On Friday, August 14th, the Census Bureau reports retail and food service sales for July. The consensus call is for a 0.2% month-over-month increase, matching the June figure. And the University of Michigan, on Friday, August 14th, releases its Consumer Sentiment Index for August. Consensus estimate is for 54.1 reading, about 1 point less than in July. Consumer expectations for the year ahead inflation was 4.2% in July. By the numbers, 200. That's the estimate of how many private colleges tapped restricted endowments to pay bills. That's up from 131 in 2021. 55.6, the ISM's Manufacturing Index in July, the highest since May of 2022 and the seventh straight month of expansion. 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are the temperatures this past week in the Russian Arctic, driven in part by a super El Nino and climate change. And $2.7 trillion, the amount of long-term spending commitments by big tech companies, led by Alphabet's $881 billion. Moving ahead in the Barrons of August 10th to the articles, new drugs could fuel fresh highs for biotechs. Positive readouts in cancer and cardiac drug trials could keep the rally going, sizing up the stakes for Merck, Moderna, Summit Therapeutics, and more, by Bill Alpert. Biotech stocks have recaptured investors' attention this year amid a wave of drug innovation, which is spurring merger and acquisition activity in the biopharma industry and a fresh round of initial public offerings. This enthusiasm has lifted the State Street SPDR S&P Biotech Exchange Traded Fund nearly 26% year-to-date to levels not seen since 2021, when Wall Street last went crazy for drugs. A 4-year bear market followed that breakout as interest rates rose and Wall Street cooled to companies without profits. This time, the bullish sentiment is likely to last. Biotech is coming off a protracted downturn, largely exacerbated by high interest rates and macro uncertainty, says venture investor Peter Kolchinsky, who runs RA Capital Management. It feels like a return to a healthy pace of activity. That may be an understatement, as Big Pharma looks to replace $200 billion to $300 billion in branded drugs coming off patent from now to 2030. Companies have gone on a spending spree, snapping up smaller outfits with drugs in testing and, in some cases, marketed products. So far this year, there have been 33 buyouts of biotech firms worth $500 million or more, with 3 deals in June and July exceeding $10 billion each. Likewise, the new issue window for biotech stocks is wide open again. 17 companies have come public this year, raising $5.5 billion, according to industry website Biopharma Dive, compared with just 8 deals in all of 2025, which raised $1.5 billion. June's $670 million debut of Parabilis Medicines was the largest biotech IPO ever. If biopharma companies are Wall Street's latest growth darlings, the longer-term outlook for their shares will depend on the success of the drugs they develop. Pivotal readouts from clinical trials for drugs to treat cancer and heart disease are coming later this year and could be catalysts for further gains in the stocks. Merck, Novartis, and Bristol-Myers Squibb are the biggest pharmaceutical companies with critical readouts ahead. Among smaller companies, biotechs Moderna and Summit Therapeutics have the most riding on test results. Drug trials have high failure rates, as investors are reminded all too frequently. Shares of AstraZeneca and Ionis Pharmaceuticals sold off in early July when the company's drug Wainua failed a phase 3 trial for a rare heart disease. At the end of the month, Novo Nordisk stock dropped 10% on news that its treatment for artery inflammation didn't meaningfully reduce heart attacks. Still, recent successes are attracting new buyers, especially as investors question the outlook for the market's other growth darling, artificial intelligence stocks. I'm seeing generalist investors interested in pharmaceuticals after a multi-year slumber, says Goldman Sachs pharma analyst Asad Haider. Even if some are buying pharma stocks as a hedge against AI shares, there's a lot of potential value from recent drug innovations, Haider adds. Cancer drugs historically have contributed about half of the drug industry's sales, and they remain a research focus, says Agustin Mojitas, a biotech analyst at Janus Henderson Investors. His firm's funds made a smart bet on Revolution Medicines, whose stock has doubled since mid-April after a phase 3 trial of its daraxonrasib pill produced unprecedented survival gains in pancreatic cancer. Once seen as a likely acquisition candidate, Revolution Medicines is now a big swallow, given its $40 billion market cap. Trial results for Summit Therapeutics' ivonescimab, another cancer drug, could prove the biggest biopharma stock catalyst of the year's second half, says Goldman Sachs biotech analyst Salveen Richter. That's because Summit has practically bet its future on the so-called PDI/VEGF bispecific antibody that combines an immune-boosting feature like that of the top-selling PD-1 inhibitor, Merck's Keytruda, with the power to choke a tumor's blood supply, like Roche's VEGF inhibitor, Avastin. Those features seem to work better in combination than administered as two separate drugs. Many hope that bispecifics, like Summit's, will become part of the next standard of care for many cancers, replacing today's combination of chemo drugs and immunotherapy. Merck sold $32 billion worth of Keytruda in 2025, but patent protections peel off in the next few years. Summit's bispecific cancer drug is looking to unseat Keytruda, Richter says. Is it going to beat Keytruda? I'm more optimistic than not that it should. Summit's Harmony 3 study will be the first global phase 3 trial that compares PD-1 VEGF antibody head-to-head against Keytruda for the treatment of lung cancer. Before year-end, the study should reveal how well. Summit's drug stalled the progression of squamous small cell lung cancer, with interim data on how many patients remain alive. Results for the more prevalent non-squamous lung cancer will come in 2027. Richter believes that the study will be deemed a success if it stalls lung cancer progression by 25 to 30% more than Keytruda. Summit's co-CEOs Bob Duggan and Maki Zengane have shown they know a good thing when they see it. In 2003, they sold the robot surgery firm Computer Motion to Intuitive Surgical. In 2015, they sold Pharmacyclics to AbbVie for $21 billion, and they were among the first U.S. pharma leaders to recognize China's growing prowess in medical research when Summit licensed ivonescimab from Hong Kong-listed Akeso in 2022. Wall Street is optimistic about Summit's drug trial because Akeso has done 4 successful trials in China. With 2 approvals there already, it's treated 70,000 Chinese patients. The amount of data already generated is tremendous, says Summit strategy chief Dave Gancartz. Summit has rights to the drug outside of China. Excitement over Akeso's trial results in China lifted Summit stock as high as $33 in the past couple of years. Lately, it's traded below $14. The consensus among analysts tracked by S&P Global's Visible Alpha is that approvals for treating cancers of the lung and other organs could lift Summit sales from nothing today to $800 million in 2028. In a decade, sales could top $30 billion. That's why the Harmony 3 trial will be a stock catalyst. Richter thinks successful readouts over the next year could vault Summit stock to $41. In a buyout, she thinks the stock could fetch above $70. Summit won't have the PD-1 VEGF bispecific market to itself, however. Bristol and Pfizer have bispecifics in clinical trials. Even Keytruda seller Merck says it's ready to put its own PD-1 VEGF into phase 3 trials. Vindication for cancer. Vaccines? Another key readout this year could vindicate vaccines as a cancer treatment. Cancer vaccines had a history of disappointment until June, when Merck and Moderna reported that a randomized phase 2 trial of their intismeran autogene vaccine cut the risk of melanoma relapse in half when used with Keytruda after surgeons removed the skin cancer. Moderna stock nearly doubled in the subsequent weeks to more than $85, although it's since fallen back to $56. The companies will report interim results later this year from the phase 3 trial of their melanoma vaccine. One reason cancer vaccines are showing better results is that doctors are using them before tumors have spread and insulated themselves against the immune system, says Moderna's Chief Development Officer David Berman. Another key to their success is the way messenger RNA technology like Moderna's can individualize the vaccine for the mutations of each patient's cancer. Moderna targets as many as 34 abnormal proteins in a patient's tumor, and side effects are minimal. The Phase 3 interim analysis could be shared at the European Society for Medical Oncology conference in late October. UBS analyst Michael Yee thinks the news might move Moderna stock as much as 25%, even though it's been neutral on it this year. A strong benefit would also bode well for vaccines that Moderna and Merck are developing for cancers of the lungs, kidneys, bladder, pancreas, and stomach. If this study is positive, what it will mean for patients is amazing, says Jane Healy, who heads Merck's early clinical development for oncology. Because cancer vaccines like intismeran are customized for each patient, it's a challenge to scale up treatment volumes, so analysts think the product will matter most for Moderna's business. The Visible Alpha consensus predicts that cancer vaccines could rise from less than 10% of Moderna's sales in 2028 to two-thirds of its $7 billion in sales by 2035. Cardiology Renaissance. This year is also delivering the fruits of what Goldman Sachs calls the cardiology renaissance. A crop of new drugs could make the biggest contribution to reducing heart attacks and strokes since statins began lowering LDL cholesterol 30 years ago. Cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death. Further research has zeroed in on other troublemakers besides LDL. One is lipoprotein a blood fat that is too high in 20% of the world's population. The condition is genetic and no amount of dieting or exercise can lower lipo-A, and there's never been a drug to treat it either, until now. In the next few months, Novartis will report the results from the Horizon study of pelacarsen, an injectable drug that's developed with Ionis Pharmaceuticals. The 8,300-person Phase 3 trial is the first pivotal test that will show whether reducing lipo-A leads to fewer heart attacks, strokes, or emergency heart stents. Success in this first test of a lipo treatment is mostly discounted in the current stock prices of Novartis and Ionis, says Richter. But their proof of concept could bring a boost to other firms testing lipo-A treatments. Amgen has a lipo-A drug in Phase 3 trials that Richter thinks will prove more potent than the Novartis product. Eli Lilly has Phase 3 studies on a lipo-A injection and a pill. Around the end of this year, Bristol Myers Squibb will learn if it has found a blood-thinning drug that is better than Eliquis, one of its big sellers. That's when Bristol should report on one of two Phase 3 trials of milvexian, a clot-preventing drug it developed in partnership with Johnson & Johnson. Patients with irregular heartbeats, known as atrial fibrillation, are often prescribed blood thinners like Eliquis or J&J's Xarelto to ward off clots that can precipitate a stroke. But as many as 40% of patients on Eliquis have to reduce their dose because such drugs increase bleeding. Early studies show that milvexian caused less bleeding as it reduced clots by inhibiting a protein called factor XI. Around year-end, one of the so-called Librexia trials will tell whether milvexian prevents additional strokes among people who've already had one. In next year's first quarter, the other trial will show if the drug prevents strokes as well as Eliquis in people with atrial fibrillation, who number some 10 million in the U.S. Eliquis was Bristol's biggest-selling drug last year, bringing in $14 billion. European market exclusivity for the drug expired earlier this year. U.S. exclusivity ends in April of 2028, and analysts see Eliquis sales falling by half that year. If milvexian proves as potent in preventing clots with less bleeding, Bristol will have found its Eliquis successor. Bristol Myers is highly levered to do this, says Hayter, of the milvexian outcomes. Now we'll move on to the cover story in Barron's of August 10th. The new Wild West. With low taxes and light regulation, Texas is booming. Investors and residents could pay a steep price, by Avi Saltzman. Now more than ever, the global economy runs through Texas. The boom is happening down at the state's southern tip, where SpaceX launches rockets from a beach just miles from the Mexico border. It's in full swing in the east, where ports in Houston and elsewhere are shipping a record amount of oil and natural gas to the world. There's a gold rush in the north, too, as Dallas transforms a banking backwater into a bona fide financial hub. And in the west, where tech companies are building their biggest artificial intelligence data centers yet. Beckoned by a growing population, abundant natural resources, non-existent income taxes, and light regulation, companies from Oracle to Tesla to Caterpillar have relocated their headquarters to the state. Texas passed California this year as the home of the most Fortune 500 companies, with 57. For 3 years running, Texas has added more jobs than any other state. It has the 8th largest economy in the world, and it's hot on the heels of France for 7th place. Texas is also well positioned to lead the U.S. in the next phase of economic growth, driven by AI. It's closer than any other part of the country to solving the technology's biggest bottleneck: energy. Texas is building more natural gas power plants than the next 7 states combined, according to energy data provider Global Energy Monitor. It's the leading state for renewable energy generation too, with wind and solar arrays going up much faster than even in climate-friendlier jurisdictions like the Northeast. Texas's power grid operates as an island, disconnected from its neighbors, which has left it stranded during some weather emergencies, but also allowed for flexible regulations that have spurred aggressive private investment. The state is experimenting with a kind of hyper-capitalism, one whose impacts are likely to be felt around the country. Its innovations are attracting imitators who see its success as a blueprint for how to spur economic growth. But the model has also drawn a backlash. Deregulation, critics say, has stacked the deck in favor of corporations and led to a race to the bottom that will affect everyone from shareholders to employees. Texas's growth is also hitting physical limits. In parts of the state, water supplies are running out. The data center boom threatens to sap them even more. One place to see Texas's growth spurt is at the base of a half-built tower rising at the center of downtown Dallas. When the 30-story building is completed next year, it'll house Bank of America's regional headquarters and the recently opened Texas Stock Exchange, which plans to install a rolling stock ticker on the side of the building. "There's no street called Y'all Street," said Linda McMahon, the head of the city's Economic Development Corporation, a civic booster, "but this is kind of what it is." The building overlooks a 5-acre park built with oil and gas money that is itself a sign of the city's transformation over the past decade. It was once a noisy freeway dug into a trench that split the downtown in two. After the freeway was covered and grass installed, it became a gathering place, hosting office workers on their lunch breaks and thousands of soccer fans for watch parties during the World Cup. Dallas banks have been lending money to oil producers for much of the past century, but the city was long considered an afterthought in the industry. There were many bad places your name could land on the job placement blackboard in 1985, but the absolute worst was in the slot marked "Equities in Dallas," wrote Michael Lewis in Liar's Poker, his era-defining book about high finance. Equities in Dallas became shorthand for career exile. That's certainly what Assam Khalil, the current head of Goldman Sachs Group's Dallas office, thought of the city at first. Khalil, who was raised on Long Island, New York, was a rising Goldman executive at the bank's New York headquarters in 2016 when he was called into the office of David Solomon, the head of investment banking, to learn about his next posting. He figured it would be some high-flying locale like London. But Solomon had other ideas. When he said, "I want you to move to Dallas," I was like, "You gotta be kidding me. Did I upset you? Did I do something wrong?" Khalil has since come around. Equities in Dallas is a relic of the early 80s, he said in an interview at Goldman's current downtown offices, a building that was considered postmodern when it was constructed in 1985. Now Goldman is building a much bigger campus about a mile away designed by a Danish architecture firm known for its opera halls. In a state filled with exurbs and sprawling office parks, Dallas's downtown looks different. It's filled with upscale housing, some of it converted from 1980s office stock. Young people are staying. Some of Dallas's wealthiest families, like the Perrots, Warrens, Hunts, and Crows, have plowed their old oil, tech, and real estate money into culture and public amenities. Goldman has increased its Dallas area workforce to more than 4,500 from 900 in 2017. Others have been on a hiring spree too. In the past decade, the financial industry added more than 100,000 employees in the Dallas area, and now has nearly 400,000. J.P. Morgan Chase has more employees in Texas than in New York, home to its new $3 billion plus headquarters. The state's former wildcatters are now old money barons looking for advisors to manage their cash. Morgan Stanley, the wealth management giant, is considering building a $1.3 billion office complex in the city, just down the street from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas's imposing limestone edifice. Charles Schwab moved its headquarters from San Francisco to the Dallas area in 2021. They're not just moving for the barbecued ribs. Companies can save millions in taxes in Texas. In California, the corporate income tax rate on banks is 10.8%. In Texas, there are no corporate income taxes. The state does charge a margin tax worth 0.75% of a bank's gross profit. Texas is making a play for business on multiple fronts. The state's top politicians aren't content with companies just moving employees to the state. They want them to shift their legal incorporation to Texas from states like Delaware and list their stocks there too. The vast majority of U.S. companies are incorporated in Delaware, whose long history in adjudicating business disputes seem to insulate it from competition. But a Delaware judge's 2024 decision to deny Elon Musk's $56 billion Tesla pay package upset the Tesla CEO and helped spur a backlash. Musk moved Tesla's legal incorporation to Texas, whose rules are considered friendlier to corporations than Delaware's. In Texas, companies can block investors who own less than 3% of their shares from submitting shareholder proposals and filing certain kinds of lawsuits. Texas has also passed rules to curb the power of proxy advisors, which sometimes tell investors to vote against corporate policies. The state has also set up its own business courts that deliver experienced judges and greater certainty for complex commercial disputes, according to Governor Greg Abbott. The rules for Texas's business courts tilt the playing field decidedly in favor of corporate insiders. SpaceX's securities filings acknowledge as much. Its bylaws force disputes to be decided by the Texas Business Court, which the company says may discourage lawsuits against us and our directors, officers, other managerial officials, and other employees. The courts impose significant hurdles on prospective plaintiffs bringing derivative lawsuits against Texas corporations, according to law firm Latham and Watkins. Texas is basically saying, we're very friendly to management, so come here, incorporate here, says Natalia Renta, Associate Director of Corporate Governance and Power at the nonprofit Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund. The state's shareholder ownership rules for filing lawsuits have never been attempted before, and they raise the specter that states will keep chipping away at the rights of small investors. Renta says Texas's moves have already inspired other states to lower guardrails protecting shareholders and give more power to corporate insiders. Both Nevada and Delaware have passed rules that make it harder for litigants to gather the evidence they need to go after corporations. It's created a race to the bottom, Renta says. The state sees stock trading as the next step for it to become a certified financial capital on par with or even above New York. The Texas Exchange got up and running as a stock trading venue in July, though it's still working on procuring its own listings. The exchange is on board with the Texasization of corporate America, says James Lee, CEO of the Texas Stock Exchange. Removing wasteful fees and onerous rules should draw more companies to public markets, he says. A stock listing is the next step to getting all of the benefits of Texas's pro-business environment. The Texas Stock Exchange is a partner in this, lowercase p, but we have similar goals, he says. NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange have ramped up their own presence in Texas, too. SpaceX was dual listed on NASDAQ's New York and Texas exchanges. NASDAQ launched its exchange in March. NASDAQ Texas President Rachel Ratch tells Barron's the decision to open the Texas venue was more a response to our clients than a competitor. From a practical perspective, however, NASDAQ Texas doesn't change much for the firm's clients, whose trades run on East Coast wires and technology. It allows companies to establish a listings presence in Texas while maintaining all of the benefits of their NASDAQ listing, she says. From a liquidity perspective, the Texas exchanges are still a blip, accounting together for less than 1% of U.S. equity market volume. Renta worries that the Texas exchanges are engaged in their own race to the bottom. Around the time of SpaceX's listing, NASDAQ changed its rules to create a fast-track process for large stocks to make it into the widely held NASDAQ 100 index after just 15 trading days, raising concerns that average investors would take on inordinate risks. And then all of a sudden their exchange gets the listing, Renta says. NASDAQ says its fast-track program was designed to make the index better reflect the market it tracks. Raj says that decision was made way before SpaceX. Texas thinks it has a political edge over New York, whose left-leaning policies have sometimes rankled the business world. The Texas Exchange won't ask companies to list board diversity statistics like the NASDAQ briefly did a few years ago before its rules were struck down by a court. Texas companies listed on the exchange also don't have to worry about taxes on trades of their stock. Voters approved a constitutional amendment last year forbidding the state from levying taxes on securities transactions, a response to a 2020 tax proposal in the New York Assembly that never moved forward. Texas politicians have pounced. Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson visited New York City in April to drum up business. He told Barron's that Dallas is clearly winning because it's the only city in the world with 3 major exchanges. It's unfair competition now with a clown being the mayor of New York City, said Texas State Senator Tan Parker, a leading proponent of the exchange on a recent podcast. He was referring to New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, a Democratic socialist whose platform includes raising taxes on the rich. Mamdani's office responded with its own boast. New York remains the capital of global finance, and New Yorkers in finance are paid better because of it. On average, they make $512,000, compared with the $162,000 that Texans take home, according to a Mamdani spokeswoman, citing numbers from labor market data service Lightcast. New York City continues to attract the higher quality, higher paying jobs in the industry, she wrote. If Dallas is Texas's shining star, Corpus Christi is its workhorse. Corpus sits on the Gulf of Mexico west of Houston. Driving in from the north, its skyline is a haze of refinery towers and chemical plants. But don't be fooled. Like any great piece of luxury real estate, you can't beat the location. Corpus is the closest major port to the Permian Basin, which pumps out more than half of America's oil. And it's the only port in the country deep enough to accommodate the oil industry's monster ships, crude carriers as long as 3 football fields. It now sends about 2.5 million barrels of crude oil overseas every day, up tenfold from a decade ago. And that's roughly half of America's total shipments. The city's also an export hub for liquefied natural gas exports, which went from a non-existent industry 10 years ago to one of America's most valuable today. It's no exaggeration to say that Corpus has changed America's place in the world. As recently as 2015, the U.S. banned crude oil exports to protect prices at home, a vestige of the 1970s oil crisis. Now oil is America's largest export category. Crude exports have ramped up about 40% this year, to a record 5.6 million barrels a day in April. Without America's extra imports, the oil price spike during the Iran war would probably be significantly more severe, writes Megan O'Sullivan, a Harvard University professor who wrote a book on the geopolitical impacts of America's energy export boom. Less than 10 hours before he started the war, President Donald Trump spoke at Corpus on February 27th. "We're witnessing a historic American energy boom like we've never seen," he said, standing on the deck in front of a massive oil tanker. "And this port is right at the center of the action." The pride in Corpus has been tempered by a bitter irony, however. Even as the city takes a major role on the world stage, there's been growing trouble at home. Corpus Christi is running out of water. The city has grown beyond its resources, and an extended drought exposed just how bad things have gotten. At risk, the basic human needs of over 500,000 people. Water taps have kept flowing so far, but the signs of crisis are visible at the reservoirs that serve them. The water level at Choke Canyon Reservoir, a lake just north of the city, was just 8% full at one point last month. Just a couple of years ago, a boat launch at the reservoir drew crowds of fun seekers fleeing South Texas's oppressive heat. Now, the pier extends out into fields of dry scrub brush. To manage the crisis, city officials began restricting water use. Starting in December of 24, they imposed Stage 3 limits on residents, forbidding them from watering their lawns and yards. Driveways cracked, sidewalks sunk into the ground, and at the same time, businesses kept humming along. Industrial users have been spared the cuts so far beyond restrictions on watering lawns on their property. City statistics show that residents cut their water use by 19% from 2023 to 2025. City manager Peter Zanoni, the top city administrator, said in an interview at Corpus City Hall that it's unfair to put all the blame on industrial users, which have gotten more efficient about water use. And he argues that the city's relative lenience on industrial users is justified. It's prioritizing water that benefits human life and health, or supports the development of a product. Big corporate users say they're doing their part. ExxonMobil, which runs a chemical plant in Corpus Christi through a joint venture, is the city's biggest water user, consuming about 13 million gallons a day. An Exxon spokeswoman said the company continually recycles water and is always looking for additional ways to reduce its water use. Zanoni says that in a level 1 situation, the city will adjust the balance. 25% usage cuts across the board. It won't enforce restrictions against residential customers, but will expect industrial users to comply. As of this spring, it looks like the level 1 emergency would come in September. Rainfall pushed the expected date back to 2028. As water worries spread, some residents are taking things into their own hands. Kathy Sanders, a retiree in Central Texas, has watched with growing unease as adjacent counties have imposed water restrictions. "The rainwater is something that's mine," she put a catchment system in like some of her neighbors. "We need to put our foot down to say what water belongs to us." Water clearly could slow the pace of Texas's growth. This past week, Governor Abbott halted new data center approvals, demanding an audit of the projects based on their water use and other factors. Texas's natural resources have helped vault it into the lead when it comes to economic growth. But they could work in the reverse, too. And with that, we've come to the end of our reading of Barron's for August 10th of 2026. This is your reader, Eric, saying be well, be safe, look after each other. Bye for now.